When he emerged from the bathroom, I almost didn't recognize him. The kid I'd seen huddled in the downpour, swallowed by an oversized hoodie, had morphed into someone I couldn't quite place. His jawline sharp and defined, his face freshly shaved, and those intensely blue eyes weren't just striking, they were unsettling. For a moment, I stood frozen, clutching the mug of tea I'd made, wondering just what I'd invited into my life. It had been one of those brutal November evenings in the city, the kind where the rain felt personal, determined to worm its way into every crack and crevice. My little boutique in Soho had been a ghost town all day, the weather keeping the shoppers at bay, and by the time I was locking up, I was already dreaming of a blanket and a glass of wine. I didn't spot him at first. He was slumped against the brick wall a few feet from my shop, head down, hoodie pulled tight. It wasn't until I turned to set the alarm that I saw him. A kid, no older than 20-something, soaked to the bone and shivering visibly. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keypad. He wasn't causing trouble, just sitting there quietly. But something about him snagged my attention. Maybe it was the way he glanced up at me, his eyes shadowed and empty, or maybe it was the flicker of desperate hope I thought I saw buried there. I should have kept walking. That would have been the smart thing to do, the sensible thing, but instead, the words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. "Hey, you okay?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at me like he couldn't believe I was talking to him. Then, he shook his head, a barely perceptible movement. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but his voice gave him away rough and shaky. I could have left it there, wished him well, and gone home. But something about him, the way he seemed so young and yet so utterly defeated, made it impossible to turn away. "You look freezing," I said, ignoring the little voice in my head screaming at me. "Need somewhere to get warm? Dry off?" His head snapped up, eyes widening just a fraction, like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. "I don't want to bother you," he said, but there was a hesitation, a tremor in his voice that screamed temptation. "No bother," I lied, gesturing towards my car, parked just across the narrow street. "Come on, you'll catch pneumonia sitting out here." For a long moment he didn't move, and I thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, slowly, pushing himself to his feet with a stiffness that hinted at how long he'd been sitting in the cold rain. When we got to my apartment in the West Village, I handed him a thick towel and some of my ex-husband's old clothes, stuff I'd never gotten around to donating. "Shower's down the hall," I said, pointing. "Take your time, I'll make some tea." He nodded, just a quiet, "Thanks," before disappearing into the bathroom. As I waited, the reality of what I'd done started to sink in. I'd brought a complete stranger into my home, a young guy who clearly had nowhere else to go and nothing to lose. It was reckless, maybe even stupidly dangerous, but something about him hadn't felt threatening. He'd seemed lost, almost fragile, and I couldn't shake the feeling he needed someone to throw him a lifeline. Still, as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a colossal mistake. Then, the bathroom door opened. When he stepped into the hallway, hair damp and skin scrubbed clean, I nearly dropped the teacup. Gone was the disheveled, hollow-eyed kid I'd picked up outside my shop. In his place stood a man who looked far too put together to have been sleeping on the streets. He caught me staring, and for the first time he smiled, a small, hesitant curve of his lips that made something tighten in my chest. "Feel better?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now, almost shy. "Thanks." As he sat down at my kitchen table, wrapping his hands around the steaming mug of tea, I realized something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just pity I felt for him. It was something else. Something like a pull. That first night with Jake was quiet. We sat at the kitchen table, the only sounds the drumming of rain against the windows and the occasional creak of the old building settling. He cradled the tea mug like it was the first warm thing he'd touched in years, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. "Thank you," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, steady, but there was a raw vulnerability in it that caught me off guard. "You're welcome," I replied, watching him. Up close, he looked even younger than I'd initially thought. Early 20s, maybe 25 at most. But there was something in his eyes that aged him, a weight that didn't belong on someone so young. "How long have you been—" I started, then trailed off, unsure how to finish the question without sounding condescending. "Homeless," he said bluntly, meeting my gaze. "A little over a year." I nodded, not knowing what to say. The word hung between us, heavy and thick with unspoken implications. "It wasn't always like this," he added, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Had a job, apartment, the whole thing. Just fell apart." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. I could see the reluctance in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed whenever he started to talk about himself. Instead, I said, "You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable with." His lips twitched into a faint smile, the first real hint of relief I'd seen on his face all evening. "Thanks," he said simply. I'd intended for Jake to leave the next morning. It wasn't that I didn't want to help him, I did. But the idea of having a stranger in my apartment, no matter how harmless he seemed, made me uneasy. When I woke up, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was streaming through the windows. I found Jake in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch where he'd slept. He was fully dressed, his damp hoodie folded neatly beside him. "I should get going," he said when he saw me standing in the doorway. "You don't have to rush," I replied, surprising myself. He hesitated, looking like he wasn't sure whether to believe me. "You've already done more than enough. I don't want to overstay my welcome." "You haven't," I said, stepping into the room. "Stay for breakfast at least. It's been a while since I've had someone to cook for." His brow furrowed, like he was trying to figure out my angle, but eventually he nodded. "Okay, just breakfast." Over scrambled eggs and toast, Jake started to open up, piece by piece. He told me about growing up upstate in a small town, about moving to the city a few years ago chasing a job that had evaporated. "It's hard to get back on your feet once you fall," he said, his voice quiet. "You try to find work, but no one wants to hire someone who doesn't have a permanent address. And once the money runs out..." He shrugged, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the air. I listened without interrupting, my chest tightening at the matter-of-fact way he described his situation. "I'm sorry," I said finally, knowing how utterly inadequate the words were. He looked up at me, his blue eyes sharper than I'd expected. "Don't be. It's not your fault." I nodded, but his words didn't make me feel any better. After breakfast, Jake helped me clean up, insisting on washing the dishes despite my protests. There was something almost endearing about the way he moved around the kitchen, a little awkward, but determined to be useful. "You don't have to do this," I said as he handed me a clean plate to dry. "I want to," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. By the time the dishes were done, I found myself dreading the idea of sending him back out into the cold. "You said you were looking for work," I said, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," he said cautiously, drying his hands on a dish towel. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything really," he said with a shrug. "Construction, landscaping, retail. I'm not picky." I hesitated, the idea forming in my mind before I could stop it. "I could use some help around here," I said. "The fire escape needs painting, and there are a few things around the apartment I've been putting off fixing. It's not much, but it's something." Jake blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You'd pay me?" "Of course," I said. "It's only fair." For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, but then he nodded. "Okay, if you're sure." "I'm sure," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure why I was doing this. Over the next few days, Jake settled into a quiet routine at my apartment. He spent his mornings painting the fire escape, fixing the squeaky closet door, and even tackling the overflowing junk drawer in the kitchen. In the evenings, we'd share simple meals and talk about everything and nothing. I learned more about him during those quiet moments than I'd expected. He told me about his younger brother back upstate, how they hadn't spoken in months. He talked about the books he used to love, the ones he hadn't read in ages because he couldn't carry them around. And slowly, I started to tell him about myself too. I told him about my boutique, how it used to feel like a dream come true, but lately it felt more like a weight. I told him about my divorce, about the years I'd spent trying to make something work that was destined to fail. Jake listened without judgment, his quiet attentiveness both comforting and disarming. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said one evening, his voice soft but certain. I laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "I don't feel strong. Maybe not right now," he said, meeting my gaze. "But you are, I can tell." Something in the way he said it made my breath catch, and I quickly looked away, unsure how to respond. It was subtle at first, the way his hand lingered on mine when he passed me a tool, the way he smiled at me like I was someone worth noticing. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew better. One evening, as we sat on the fire escape watching the city lights twinkle to life, Jake turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Why did you help me?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. "Because you needed it," I said simply. His gaze lingered on me, and for a moment the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. "Not everyone would have done what you did," he said quietly. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Maybe not, but I'm glad I did." His lips curved into a small, genuine smile, and my chest tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was in that moment that I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just helping Jake out of kindness. I was drawn to him. in a way that scared me as much as it intrigued me, and I had no idea what to do about it. It happened on the fourth night. By then, Jake had already begun to feel like a fixture in my life. I told myself it was temporary, just a way to help him get back on his feet, but the truth was harder to admit. I didn't want him to leave. We'd fallen into an unspoken rhythm. He spent his days working around the apartment, fixing things I'd neglected for years. In the evenings, we'd eat together, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times talking about everything from his favorite bands to my disastrous attempts at indoor gardening. That night, the rain returned, pounding against the windows and turning the city outside into a blur of shadows and water. A power outage plunged the apartment into darkness just after dinner, leaving us with only candles to light the room. "Haven't seen a storm like this in years," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. The candlelight cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the surprising warmth in his eyes. "It's kind of peaceful in a way," I replied, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too soft, too uncertain. He smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should have. "You always this calm during storms?" I shrugged, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. "Not always, but it's not like there's much we can do about it." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching out between us like a thread pulled too tight. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his attention making my skin prickle. "You're different than I expected," he said finally, his voice low. "Different how?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "I don't know," he said, leaning forward slightly. "When I first met you, I thought you were just kind, generous, but I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "Sarah," he interrupted gently, his eyes searching mine, "don't push me away. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. All I know is that one moment we were sitting across from each other, the candlelight flickering between us, and the next, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His hands cupped my face, his touch warm and steady, and I felt something inside me crack open, something I hadn't realized I'd been holding back for years. When the kiss deepened, I let out a soft, involuntary gasp, and that seemed to break whatever restraint he'd been holding on to. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the heat of his body against mine. The storm outside, the candles, everything else faded away. "Jake, wait," I whispered, my voice trembling as I pulled back slightly. His eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low. I opened my mouth to say the words, but they wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head, my breath hitching as he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine. When I woke up the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city outside quiet and still. For a moment, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: guilt, desire, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. I should have felt ashamed. Jake was young, far younger than me, and he'd been relying on my kindness to get back on his feet. What we'd done felt like crossing a line I had no business approaching. But as much as I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch. The way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered. When I finally got up and made my way to the kitchen, Jake was already there, frying eggs on the stove. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard me, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. "Morning," I replied, my throat tight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly. "About last night," I began, but he cut me off. "I don't regret it," he said simply, turning off the stove and setting the pan aside. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Jake, Don't say it was a mistake," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Because it wasn't. Not to me. His words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. Over the next few days, something shifted between us. The easy rhythm we'd fallen into before was replaced by something more charged, more complicated. Jake was careful not to push me, giving me space even as he found subtle ways to remind me of what we'd shared. A lingering touch when he handed me a dish. A quiet compliment that left me flustered. I, on the other hand, tried to pretend nothing had happened. I buried myself in work, spending long hours at the boutique, avoiding him as much as possible. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the pull I felt whenever he was near. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Jake sat down across from me, his expression serious. "You're avoiding me," he said bluntly. "I'm not," I replied, though the words felt like a lie. "Yes, you are," he said, leaning forward. "And I get it. This isn't normal, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stared at him, my heart racing. "Jake, you don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. There are consequences to this." "I don't care about the consequences," he said, his tone steady. "I care about you." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "Tell me you don't feel the same way," he said softly. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that this was wrong, that it couldn't happen again, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I did feel the same way. The days that followed blurred into a strange, intoxicating rhythm. Jake and I had crossed a line, and we both knew it. But instead of retreating, we kept going, drawn to each other in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible to ignore. The boundaries of what was acceptable, what was right, dissolved into the background, leaving only the raw pull between us. We became experts in subtlety. A brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the kitchen, the quiet heat in his gaze when no one else was looking. By day, I pretended nothing had changed, keeping up the appearance of normalcy. But by night, when the apartment grew quiet and the rest of the world faded away, Jake would find me, and everything I'd been holding back would unravel. One evening, after a long day at the boutique, I came home to find Jake cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, and for a moment, I just stood in the doorway watching him. He looked so at ease, so natural, like he belonged there. "You're home late," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "Busy day," I replied, setting my bag down. He turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. "You should sit down. Dinner's almost ready." I hesitated, but eventually sat at the kitchen table, watching as he moved around the space with quiet confidence. "Where'd you learn to cook?" I asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "My mom," he said simply, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She always said you can't survive on takeout forever." There was a note of sadness in his voice, but he didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. When he brought the plates to the table, the tension between us felt almost unbearable. It wasn't just the closeness of our chairs or the way his knee brushed mine under the table. It was the way he looked at me, his eyes lingering on mine just a little too long. "Jake," I began, my voice soft but unsure. "Don't," he said, cutting me off gently. Don't overthink this." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we couldn't keep doing this, but the words caught in my throat. That night after dinner, Jake didn't retreat to the couch like he usually did. Instead, he stayed close, leaning against the counter as I washed the dishes. "You don't have to hover," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm not hovering," he replied, his voice low. "I'm just keeping you company." I glanced at him over my shoulder, my heart pounding as I caught the intensity in his gaze. "Jake," I said softly, setting a dish down. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the towel. The touch was fleeting but electric, sending a shiver down my spine. Before I could pull away, he turned me to face him, his hands resting lightly on my waist. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't. The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the urgency of our first night together. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer as his lips moved against mine. I lost myself in him, in the warmth of his touch, and the way he made me feel like the only thing that mattered. Over the next week, our relationship deepened, becoming something neither of us could deny or ignore. Jake found excuses to be close to me, whether it was helping me rearrange the living room or joining me for errands downtown. We were careful, always mindful of the thin line we were walking. But no matter how discreet we tried to be, there were moments when the risk felt too real, too close. One afternoon, as we were driving back from the hardware store, I caught sight of a familiar face, my friend Jessica, who lived just a few blocks away. She waved enthusiastically as she passed, and my stomach tightened with dread. "Who's that?" Jake asked, glancing at me curiously. "Just a friend," I said quickly, my voice tighter than I intended. The encounter left me shaken, a stark reminder of how precarious our situation was. If anyone found out about us, my friends, my neighbors, David, my ex, it would ruin everything. As much as I tried to ignore it, the imbalance in our relationship became more apparent with each passing day. Jake was young, impulsive, and fiercely independent, while I was cautious, calculated, and weighed down by years of responsibilities and regrets. One evening, after another stolen moment in the quiet of my bedroom, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You don't trust me," he said, his voice soft but certain. I frowned, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "You keep holding back," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Like you're afraid I'm going to break, or run, or, I don't know, disappoint you." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not that simple, Jake." "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. I hesitated, struggling to put my feelings into words. "You're young," I said finally. "You have your whole life ahead of you. And me? I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in mine." His brow furrowed, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then he reached for my hand, his touch steady and grounding. "You're more than you give yourself credit for," he said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." One night, as we sat on the fire escape, the conversation took a more serious turn. "Why did you really help me, Sarah?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the city sounds. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Because you needed it," I said simply. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's not the whole truth." I looked down at my hands, my chest tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Or maybe I just didn't want to be alone." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "You've saved me, you know," he said finally, his voice softer. "More than you realize." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "You don't have to say that," I said, my voice trembling. "It's the truth," he replied, his tone steady. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as the woman I'd become, but as the person I'd once been. The affair that had once felt intoxicating, even thrilling, began to unravel under the weight of its own intensity. Jake and I were playing a dangerous game, and the cracks in our carefully constructed world were becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the secrecy, though that alone was exhausting. It was the imbalance between our ages, our expectations, and the unspoken truths we were both too afraid to confront. One afternoon, while Jake was repainting the fire escape, Jessica, my closest friend, stopped by unexpectedly. She strolled up the brownstone steps, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head and a bakery box in her hand. "Thought I'd bring you some of those lemon tarts you like," she said brightly. "Figured you could use a little pick-me-up." My stomach flipped as I glanced toward Jake. He was standing on the ladder, paintbrush in hand, his t-shirt damp with sweat and clinging to his chest. He looked up just in time to see Jessica, his brow furrowing slightly, before he quickly turned back to his work. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile and stepping forward to intercept her. "That's really sweet of you." Jessica's gaze drifted to Jake, her curiosity palpable. "Who's that?" she asked, lowering her voice slightly. "Just someone helping with some repairs around the apartment," I said casually, hoping my tone didn't betray me. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "Well, he seems handy," she said with a sly smile. I forced a laugh, but my pulse was racing. Every second Jessica lingered felt like a ticking time bomb. After a few minutes of small talk, I managed to usher her back toward the steps, thanking her profusely for the tarts. But as soon as she walked away, I felt a knot of dread settle in my chest. When I turned back to the apartment, Jake was standing at the base of the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "Friend of yours?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his expression tense. "Yeah," I said quickly. "She just stopped by to drop something off." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. That night, the tension between us finally boiled over. Jake was unusually quiet at dinner, his movements clipped and deliberate as he cleared the table. I tried to ignore it, but the weight of his silence was unbearable. "What's wrong?" I asked finally, setting my fork down. He glanced at me, his jaw tightening. "You tell me," he said. I frowned, taken aback. "I don't know what you mean." "Jessica," he said, his tone sharp. "Why didn't you tell her about me?" "Because it's none of her business," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Is that really why?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing. I opened my mouth to argue, but the truth caught in my throat. "You're ashamed of me," he said quietly, the words cutting deeper than I'd expected. "No," I said quickly, though even I didn't believe it. "It's not that. It's just complicated." "Complicated?" he repeated bitterly, shaking his head. "Sarah, you don't understand." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "What's the worst that could happen? People will judge you, whisper about you behind your back?" His words stung because they were true. "You don't get it," I said, my voice rising. "You don't know what it's like to have people expect you to be perfect all the time, to have your every decision scrutinized." "Maybe I don't," he said, his tone softening. "But I do know what it's like to be invisible, and I'm tired of pretending like I don't matter." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "You do matter," I said finally, my voice breaking. "More than you realize." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't enough. The next day, as Jake was working on the fire escape, I found him sitting on the steps, his head in his hands. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously, stepping closer. He looked up, his eyes red and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. I hesitated, but nodded. Sitting down beside him, he took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching nervously. Before I ended up on the streets, I was in trouble, real trouble. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What kind of trouble?" "Legal trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got involved with the wrong people, made some stupid decisions. And when everything fell apart, I didn't have anyone to turn to." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Because I didn't want you to see me like that," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want you to think I was just some screw-up who didn't deserve your help." My heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, and I reached out to take his hand. "Jake, that doesn't change how I feel about you," I said softly. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "You mean that?" "Yes," I said firmly. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of his confession settling between us. But the cracks in our relationship only deepened after that. Jake's growing independence, while admirable, also created distance between us. He started working odd jobs around the neighborhood, spending less time at the apartment and more time out in the world. I tried to be supportive, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing insecurity that came with watching him build a life that didn't revolve around me. One evening, after he came home late from work, we had another argument. "You don't have to check in with me every second of the day," he said, his frustration boiling over. "I'm not checking in," I snapped. "I'm trying to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," he said sharply. "You don't have to keep treating me like some lost puppy." His words stung, and I felt my throat tighten. "Is that what you think this is? Me treating you like a project?" "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe. Sometimes it feels like you don't trust me to take care of myself." "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. "I've done everything I can to help you." "I know," he said, his tone softening, "but sometimes it feels like you're holding me back." The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. By the time the argument ended, something between Jake and me had shifted. He left the living room without another word, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared into the guest room. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to keep myself from breaking down. His words echoed in my mind. "Sometimes it feels like you're holding me back." I wanted to scream, to cry, to argue, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The next morning, Jake was already gone when I woke up. He'd left a note on the kitchen table. "Working a double shift today. Don't wait up." The note felt like a wall being built between us, brick by brick. For weeks, we'd been stealing moments together, keeping our connection alive in the quiet spaces between his work and my routines. But now, even those moments felt out of reach. I tried to distract myself by throwing all my energy into the boutique. I reorganized the stockroom, updated the display windows, and even started brainstorming ideas for a holiday promotion. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the weight of Jake's absence hung over me like a storm cloud. That night, when he came home, I was sitting on the couch, a book open in my lap. He walked past me without a word, heading straight for the shower. When he finally emerged, his hair still damp, I tried to bridge the gap between us. "How was work?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Fine," he said shortly, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. I watched him, my chest tightening. "Jake, we need to talk." "Not now," he said, his tone clipped. "Then when?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You've been avoiding me for days. You barely look at me, and when you do, it's like you're a million miles away." He sighed, setting the bottle down on the counter. "I'm not avoiding you, I'm just tired." "Tired of what?" I pressed. "Tired of me?" His silence was answer enough. The breaking point came 2 days later. I'd come home from work early, hoping to talk things through with Jake, to finally clear the air. But when I walked into the apartment, I found him packing a bag in the guest room. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "I think it's time I moved on," he said simply. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Moved on?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Jake, what are you talking about?" He straightened, his hands resting on the edge of the bed. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "It's not working anymore." I stared at him, my chest tightening with a mixture of anger and desperation. "So that's it? You're just going to leave?" "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But staying here, it's not fair to either of us." "Not fair?" I said, my voice breaking. "Jake, I've done everything I can to help you. I opened my home to you, gave you a chance to get back on your feet." "I know," he interrupted, his tone sharp, "and I'll always be grateful for that. But this isn't healthy for either of us." His words cut deeper than I expected, and I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "So what?" I asked. "You're just going to walk away? Pretend like none of this ever happened?" "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice steady. "But I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out who I am on my own." I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Jake had made up his mind, and no amount of pleading would bring him back to me. The night before he left, we sat together on the fire escape, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. The moonlight cast a soft glow over his face, and for a moment I let myself memorize every detail. His sharp jawline, the way his hair fell over his forehead, the quiet strength in his eyes. "I don't regret any of it," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "Neither do I admitted. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "You saved me, Sarah," he said softly. "More than you'll ever know." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I squeezed his hand tightly. "You saved me too," I whispered. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding on to each other even as we both knew it was the end. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was quiet. Jake's bag was gone, and so was he. On the kitchen table, he'd left a note. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget you." I sat down at the table, the note clutched in my hands, and let myself cry. Not just for him, but for the fragile, unexpected life we'd built together, however brief it had been. I didn't know where Jake was going or what his future held, but I hoped he'd find what he was looking for. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to find my own way forward too. When Jake left, it felt like the city itself had stopped humming. For weeks, the apartment was unbearably quiet. The mornings were the hardest, waking up to an empty space where his presence had once been. His coffee mug, the one he'd always used, still sat on the counter, and every time I glanced at it, the hollow ache in my chest grew. But life in New York doesn't wait for anyone, not even for a broken heart. The first few days after Jake's departure, I threw myself into work. The boutique became my sanctuary, a place where I could keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. I reorganized shelves, updated inventory, and chatted with customers as though my world hadn't just fallen apart. But the nights were different. Alone in the apartment, the silence pressed in from every direction. I'd catch myself glancing at the guest room door, half expecting Jake to walk through it with one of his easy smiles. I'd hear a creak in the floorboards and instinctively think it was him. One evening, as I was cleaning out the fridge, I found a leftover container of pasta he'd made the week before he left. I sat down on the kitchen floor, the cool tile against my skin, and cried until I couldn't breathe. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild, not just my routine, but myself. I reconnected with Jessica, who had noticed my withdrawal but hadn't pried. Over coffee, one afternoon, she asked, "Are you okay? You've seemed off lately." "I'm fine," I said automatically, but then I stopped myself. "No, actually, I'm not." Her concerned gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, I told someone the truth. Not all of it, of course. Jake's name never came up, nor did the nature of our relationship. But I told her enough for her to understand that I'd been struggling, that I was trying to piece myself back together after losing something I hadn't even realized I needed. "You'll get through this," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're stronger than you think." One evening, months after Jake had left, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Jake. I just wanted to let you know I'm doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart racing. I read it over and over, trying to decipher the emotions it stirred in me. Relief, sadness, hope, and something bittersweet I couldn't quite name. I hesitated before typing a response. "I'm glad to hear that. I hope you're finding what you're looking for." His reply came quickly. "I am. Thank you for everything." And just like that, the conversation was over. But that small exchange, those few words, brought me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Jake was moving on, and it was time for me to do the same. In the months that followed, I started to rediscover parts of myself that I'd neglected for years. I took up yoga, something I'd always been curious about but had never made time for. I spent weekends exploring Central Park, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature in the middle of the city. And slowly, I began to see the apartment not as a place haunted by Jake's absence, but as a space that was mine, a reflection of the person I was becoming. The boutique, once just a distraction, became a source of pride. I expanded my inventory, hosted neighborhood events, and even started an Instagram page to promote the store. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that mattered. Jake never faded completely from my thoughts. There were moments when I'd hear a song he used to hum, or catch the scent of garlic and rosemary and feel a pang of longing. But instead of dwelling on what I'd lost, I chose to focus on what I'd gained. Jake had brought chaos into my life, yes, but he'd also brought clarity. He'd forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. The loneliness I'd buried under routine, the desire for connection I'd been too afraid to admit. He reminded me that I was still capable of feeling, of wanting, of living. One evening, as I sat on the fire escape with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of orange and pink, I realized something. Jake's departure hadn't left me broken. It had left me stronger. I wasn't the same woman I'd been when he walked into my life. I was braver now, more willing to take risks and embrace the messy, unpredictable nature of life. I finished my wine and stood, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over me. The apartment was still, but for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. Life went on, as it always does. I found joy in small moments. A customer's smile, a warm cup of coffee on a cold morning, the laughter of friends during a long overdue dinner party. Jake had been a chapter in my life, one that had ended far too soon, but had left an indelible mark. And while I still thought of him from time to time, I knew he was part of my past, not my future. One day, as I was rearranging the boutique's window display, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. I looked different, stronger, more confident, and for the first time in a long time, I liked what I saw.